If we're going to look at what the nature of God is, and to understand the idea of God in the world, and the whole idea of the existence of God and what it means, one place that we could turn to possibly is science, to see what science, which really deals with nature and the essence of nature and what is within nature, to see what science has to say on the topic of God's existence. What's interesting is that you generally don't find scientists in any serious way trying to define God, trying to understand if or where God fits into the picture. And I think it leads to the conclusion that science basically negates the idea of God's existence. What's interesting is if you really look at what science is talking about, science very clearly is trying to address the nature of this world as we understand it. Science doesn't really deal directly with the question of God's existence in a meaningful way, mainly because it is not within the parameters of science to deal with things that are beyond nature. If we were to look at the mandate of what science has created for itself in the days since Isaac Newton, the basic mandate of science is to try to understand the world in a natural way, which means you will not find scientists dealing with the whole idea of supernatural, of spiritual, of miracles, and of God, because those ideas, by definition, are ideas that are beyond the laws of nature. If a scientist saw an open miracle take place right in front of him, he wouldn't conclude in scientific terms that he witnessed a miracle. If the most unusual event took place in front of him that anybody else would say that was a miracle, the scientist, in the name of science, would have to say it's an unexplained phenomenon. Which means science, when it's really probing the question of what the universe is essentially made of, where the universe essentially comes, science can only start from the moment of the Big Bang and on. Science can tell us there's a cause and effect nature to the universe. Science can tell us that ultimately it all started from a Big Bang. The discovery in the 1920s of Big Bang cosmology, that the universe started from one particle, and the particle expanded, and the particle evolved, and the energy evolved into different forms of matter, and that's where we came from. Science is dealing essentially with the here and now, from the moment of the Big Bang, when time and space first came into existence, and on is the realm of science. If you were to ask a scientist what made the Big Bang, where did that first bit of time and space come from? Where did that energy, that singularity, the beginning of everything come from? A scientist is really in no better position to answer the question than you or I. Because you're asking somebody who's an expert in the laws of nature to describe the origin of something that's before there was such a thing called nature. So a scientist, from the moment of the Big Bang and on, is the expert. But coming to the moment of the Big Bang and even explaining the idea of something coming into existence where there are no laws of nature, where there is no matter, where there is no energy, is something that a scientist can't really deal with. There was a cosmologist once who wrote a book with a thesis trying to explain the nature of the universe. He was very bothered by the idea that if there is a Big Bang, people are concluding that there must have been a creator who started that creation. This was a scientist who really didn't believe in the concept of a God at all. He was bothered by the idea of people saying, there's a Big Bang, there's a creation, there must be a creator. And he proposed a theory. He said, I don't believe at all that you need to have God as a theory for where the Big Bang came from. I don't believe you need to say that there's something infinite that made finite. What was his proposal? He said, maybe there's something else altogether that created the Big Bang. And he called it, his terminology was, there was a potential vector field. Whatever that means exactly. There was a potential vector field, and that is the thing that created the finite reality of the Big Bang and all the laws of nature. So I wrote this scientist a letter, and I asked him a very simple question. I said, if you're proposing that the potential vector field is the source of all of finite existence, is the potential vector field itself a finite thing or an infinite thing? If you say the potential vector field is a finite thing, then you're right back to where you started. Where did this potential vector field come from? It's a finite thing. It's part of the laws of the universe. It's part of the chain reaction of cause and effect. It must have come from somewhere. If, on the other hand, you say the potential vector field is infinite, it's beyond time, it's beyond space, it's all-powerful, it's infinite, it has no limits whatsoever, then there's no real difference between you, who says there's an all-powerful source called the potential vector field, and me, who says there's an all-powerful infinite force called God. The scientist didn't write back to me. He did publish another book 2 years later where he said he's revised his theory, he no longer has an answer to the question. And it makes us realize that science is really stuck and unable to deal with the idea of an infinite creator, because essentially it's going beyond the parameters of what science is really all about. If you were to ask a modern scientist today, does science support the idea of God? I think you'll find the answer being science doesn't essentially deal with the idea of God, because the basis of science is to deal with nature. The whole presumption of nature is that nature itself must have a source. Science can't deal with that source because science only deals with what we find within nature. At the end of the day, what it essentially means is, out of all of the possible ways of looking at the world, there's only one approach that we have that actually has logic, and there is no alternative theory that any scientist or any philosopher to this day has been able to put on the table. We know there's a finite world. We know the world is a system of cause and effect on every level in everything we see, and as a matter of fact, that's what science essentially says. Science tells us that the entire world follows the pattern of cause and effect. The only logical conclusion that a person could come to, if a person's willing to think through this riddle to the end point, the only conclusion that a person can come to is that there must be something not finite that created the system called finite. That thing that's not finite is not bound by space and time because it created space and time. It's not made up of energy or matter because it initiated and created the whole idea of energy and matter. So that logically, the only conclusion to finite existence is that there must have been and must still be something called infinite that created the finite.